Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to episode 58 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Sculpture synth, which is a really cool physical modeling synth in Logic 10 and as well as version 9. Sculpture is a really, I think, underused synthesizer, and it's really vast. There's a lot of sort of really deep modulation techniques that we can do with it that I'm frankly just not going to have time to do with this short video. So keep in mind that this video is just an overview of Sculpture, how to get used to using it, just an overview of its main features, not necessarily a complete tutorial. If you're really interested in that, you can go check out the manual. So let me just go ahead and load in Sculpture here. There we go. And by the way, if my voiceover sounds a little different, it's just because I'm trying out a different recording method that is a bit more efficient and easier on my end than what I normally do. Okay, so this is just the stock patch that you get. It sounds like this. So it's sort of just sort of steel-like string sound. And that's one of the things about Sculpture that you have to keep in mind, that the physical modeling nature of Sculpture makes it very esoteric synthesis-wise. The way Sculpture works, is designed to work, is it's supposed to emulate a string. And the thing is that there are some string sounds in Sculpture that we can create that you couldn't normally create in the acoustic world. So you're not going to see like the typical oscillator, option where you can choose between sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth. It's a little bit different than that. Sculpture's synthesis is powered by two things. One, this material pad here, and two, the string display, and these three objects. So let's talk about this part first before we move on to anything else. First and foremost, I'm going to turn off this delay effect because there's a built-in delay right on the stock setting. I'm just going to go ahead and turn that off. And I'm also going to turn the EQ off as well. There we go. All right, so Sculpture's synthesis, first and foremost, is powered by this material pad. This is basically what physical modeling synthesis is all about. Modeling synthesis means that you can synthesize or you have an oscillator that aims to emulate a real-life material or object. So in this case, we have four options: nylon, wood, steel, and glass. So as you go down to steel, we get more sort of like a sawtooth, buzzy sound. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull the release down a bit. Nylon, wood, which is kind of like almost sounding like a xylophone or a marimba, and glass, which is more of like a bell-like tone, like a crystalline tone. Let me go ahead and pull the release up just a bit more, though. Okay, so this is the first option you can choose. Is you can choose between nylon, wood, glass, and steel. You can also kind of blend them together. So if I want something to sound in between nylon and steel, I can do so. I can get a little bit of the buzziness of the steel if I pull down a bit more. There we go. So you'll see there's two options, or two sort of parameters here, if you will. There's inner loss and stiffness. The higher you go, the more inner loss from the string, if you will, you get. And the more to the right you go, the stiffer the string is. So nylon and steel, you'll find, will sort of ring out a lot. I mean, glass kind of rings out a lot too, but it's more of like sort of like a resonating effect and less of sort of like a ringing effect. So that's what the material pad does. It's essentially our oscillator. It allows us to choose what sort of tone we want. Around the material pad, there are three sliders: media loss, resolution, and tension mod. So keep in mind, again, that the Sculpture synth emulates a string. So strings can be rung, they can ring out, they can have tension applied to them, they can be dampened. And this is what the media loss slider does. It allows us to essentially determine how much dampening on the string we have. So if the media loss slider all the way down, the string is going to ring out as much as it possibly will without playing around with the release time at all. As you pull the release slider up, you're going to hear more and more dampening on the string. Let's pull this up a bit more. Yeah, you pull it up too much and it's almost nothing. So basically you can choose between whether you want a really sort of staccato sound or more of like a ringing sound. So I'm going to keep the media loss all the way down. The resolution controls how many harmonics in the waveform, if you will, that we have. As we pull this down, the tone's going to get simpler and simpler and sound more like a sine wave. And as you pull this up, you'll hear more of the characteristic features of each of the materials. So let me go down just steel, which is really, very sawtooth-like. With the resolution all the way up, you get a very complex, buzzy tone. As I pull this down, we start to lose some of the high end. Sounds a little bit more muted. As we go all the way to the bottom, we get something that sounds very much like a sine wave. And the same thing will go for all of these. So the resolution controls how many harmonics this particular material has that you're on. Tension modulation is basically emulates the pitch drift in a string. If you're a guitar player, you probably know this already, but if you really pluck a string real hard, you'll hear the pitch sort of wobble a little bit right when you pluck the string, just caused from the tension of plucking the string. So that's what the tension modulation slider does. With it all the way down, every note will basically be in tune. But as you pull this up, you'll hear more or less of a bit of a wobble effect in it, in the pitch, that is. And one thing I should mention is that with certain settings on some of these sliders, certain materials don't really work out very well. Like, for instance, if I put it on steel and pull the tension modulation all the way up, you can see the string over here is kind of going crazy. Doesn't really know what to do. The glass doesn't really know what to do either. So there are certain settings that don't quite work out properly with tension modulation. So I'm going to keep that where it's at. Now there's three other options down here. It says hide, key scale, and release. What key scale does is it imposes a low and high range slider on each one of the sliders. So the green is the low and the blue is the high. So on media loss here, if I pull this maybe more toward the center, pull the low slider down and the high slider up, what this is representing is it's representing middle C on your keyboard with the main slider, and the highest keyboard on your MIDI keyboard, or the highest key, I should say, in the MIDI range, and the lowest key in the MIDI range. So as you play up from middle C, you'll get more media loss, and as you play lower than middle C, you'll get less media loss. So let me start on middle C and just play a C major scale. So the higher I play, the more muted it gets, the more media loss we have. If I play backwards, I get less media loss in the low range. Likewise, I can flip these sliders here and do the opposite. So the high notes ring a bit more, and the low notes are dampened more. Now, obviously, I wouldn't use it, this wide. But one of the things that this can do is sort of emulate the natural ring and dampening that you get from larger strings and thinner strings. And if anyone who's ever played a classical guitar, you know that the nylon strings, the upper strings, tend to ring out, or tend to be muted a bit more, rather, and the steel strings, the bottom three strings, tend to ring a bit more. So you can sort of emulate the natural characteristic of a stringed instrument, just by doing something like this, not going to the extreme like I did before. So now my lows are slightly more ringy than my high notes. I'm actually going to pull these all back to center. And by the way, just like with anything in Logic, you can option click on them, and they'll reset back to their default value. Resolution, same thing here. I can set maybe sort of like a middle resolution, set a low and a high range. And so the higher I play, the more harmonics I'm going to hear. The lower I play, the less. Going backward. So the lower I go, the more like a sine wave it sounds. I'm going to set those back to default as well. And then tension modulation as well. I'm not going to bother demonstrating that one, but it works the same way. All right. I'm going to make sure that my media loss is set to the lowest value. I'm going to make sure that my two range sliders, key scale sliders here are set to the same value as well before I move on to the release tab here. What the release tab does is it adds just a high range slider just to media loss. And what release does is it factors in the release time when you let go of the key and how that affects media loss. So if I keep media loss all the way down, but then I pull the high range slider all the way up, basically if I press down on the keys and hold the keys, the tone will ring out more. And if I hit it just softly, it gets dampened. Likewise, I can use this in reverse, where the media loss slider is all the way up, and then the range slider is all the way down. The release slider, rather, is all the way down. And if I hold the keys, they're really dampened. Actually, let's pull this down a bit. It's a bit too much. There we go. I'm holding the keys down right now. When you press the keys down and hold them, it dampens the string, much like it would if you pluck the string and then put your thumb on it or put your hand on it. Whereas if I pluck the string and then pull my hand away from the keys, it'll ring a bit more. Versus being dampened. So it's a way to sort of emulate the dampening effect of a string. All right. So I like this the way it is. We go. The next part of sort of the oscillator of sculpture is the three objects over here in this sort of string display. What you have are three objects, and these three objects can either sort of impulse or generate a sound with the string, or they can disturb the string in some way. So imagine these objects as things like a pick or a plectrum or a hammer, or maybe drumsticks, or blowing on the string, kind of like you would like with a flute, even though I know there's not a string on a flute. Again, some of these synthesis techniques and sculpture are a bit esoteric. Object one, if you go to the type of object, has 7 or 8 different options. That can impulse or make the string generate sound. You have impulse, strike, gravity strike, pick, bow, bow wide, noise, and blow. Impulse, strike, and gravity strike and pick are all very similar. These are ways you can make the string generate a sound kind of like a hammer or a pick would. Impulse is supposed to sound like an impulse of energy on the string. Strike and gravity strike are supposed to sound like a hammer, like a piano hammer. Pick is meant to sound like a plectrum, like a guitar pick. Bow and bow wide are meant to sound sort of like a violin bow. And you'll notice that with bow, bow wide, noise, and blow, the sound is actually sustained when you hold the key, regardless of whether you have the sustain and the volume envelope up or not. Noise is supposed to simulate injecting white noise into the string, and then blow is supposed to emulate sort of like a mouthpiece, like a flute. So let's try each one of these out. This is impulse. And by the way, I have objects 2 and 3 turned off. You just click on the number to turn them on or off. And then this is the volume knob for each. So this is impulse. It's got quite a bit of a picky effect, but not as much as like the actual pick option. One's a bit softer. Strike. bit of a harder attack to it. Gravity Strike. That one almost has sort of like a bouncing effect a bit, almost like the hammer hits the string and like stays on the string just from gravity pulling the hammer down. This is Bow. This is Bow Wide. We have Noise. And then lastly, we have Blow. Get a bit too much bass in there, but that's okay. One thing I should mention is that each of these impulse types are going to sound different depending on what material you're using, what settings you have out here, the volume of the object, and also, believe it or not, the placement of the object. Down here in this display, you see these sliders for 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3. These sliders actually represent the sort of emulated placement of each of the objects on the string. This green line is supposed to simulate the string. Likewise, A and B here, these sliders are actually the pickups where sound is being picked up on the string. Again, it's not a physical thing, it's a virtual thing. It's a virtual emulation of a string. And if you're a guitar player, you're already very familiar with this. You can have a pickup that's toward the bridge, on the guitar. It's going to give you a different tone than the one that's toward the neck. You get two different tones, bridge pickup or neck pickup. You'll also, if you're a guitar player, you'll know that if you pick the string, toward the end of the string, you get more of a brighter tone. Whereas if you pick it more toward the middle, you get a bit more of a bass response out of it. So the placement of the pickups and the objects do affect the overall tone of the string. Now, I'm going to jump over to Object 3 for a moment. Object 3 just has disturb types, not impulse types. So this means that most of these, other than bouncing, can't really produce any tone on their own. So these are sort of like things that are on the string or attached to the string or next to the string that are affecting the overall tone. So what I'm going to do is, just for this one example, I'm going to turn Object 1 off, turn Object 3 on, which it already is, and put this on bouncing, because this is the only one that works by itself. This one's really cool because it almost sounds like a drum roll or like a drumstick, like almost like some mallets rolling on the string. The other ones don't really do anything on their own. So you have to kind of use Object 1 or Object 2 to sort of impulse the string and disturb the string. So disturb and disturb two-sided are meant to emulate an object like a peg or a piece of metal or something that is right next to the string. And when you pluck the string, it's supposed to simulate the string sort of bouncing off or being disturbed by that object. Obviously, with the strength all the way up, we're not getting a very good tone. So if you pull this down a bit, we get sort of like a distorted tone there. Bound is supposed to sound like an object surrounding the string. Let me pull the strength up a bit there. There we go. Mass is supposed to feel almost like an anchor on the string, like if you could just imagine a string with sort of like a fishing weight put right on the string. That's what mass is supposed to sound like. So you notice there's a bit of like a pitch drift in it. Let me pull the strength up a bit more. There you go. It's a bit of sort of a pitch drift in it. And then dampen is supposed to sound like the string being dampened by something. So it almost sounds kind of like what media loss did earlier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use Object 1 and 3. I'm going to turn bouncing on. And Object 2, by the way, is the same as 1 and 3, except it has both impulse types and disturb types. So I'm going to go with impulse for number 1 and bow wide for number 2. Pull the amount down a bit. There we go. there's a sound we've synthesized. Now, for each one of these, there's a gate that says key on always or key off. Basically, this determines whether that object is sounding just when you press the keys, just when you release the keys, or always. So like my bouncing here, it's on key on. If I say just key off, we only hear the bouncing effect when I release the keys. And I'll release, hear a little bit of bounce. So there we go. I'm going to keep these on key on, though. Actually, I'm going to keep this on always. There we go. All right, let's take a look at the filter down here. Filter is a typical filter. We have 5 different filter types: high pass, low pass, peak, band pass, and notch. If you don't know what these mean, high pass means that you're allowing highs but cutting lows. Low pass allows lows, cuts highs. Peak is much like an EQ, like a band and an EQ. Band pass allows a set of center frequencies through while cutting highs and lows. And the notch is like the inverse of band pass. Another name for notch is band reject. So you're cutting mid frequencies but allowing highs and lows. So if I want to sort of soften the overall tone, I can use a low pass to cut out some of the high frequencies. And the way you do it is pull your cutoff frequency down a bit. Get more of like a pad type effect. I'm going to go ahead and turn off object 3 here. I'm going to pull up object 2, pull object 1 down, pull the cutoff up a bit. I'm going to make the bow wide be key on as well. There we go. Resonance is just feedback at the cutoff frequency. So as you boost this, you'll get a bit of sort of like frogginess, sort of like a high frequency whistling effect. Not literally a whistling effect, but sort of like a high frequency feedback effect. Velocity sensitivity basically makes the cutoff frequency reactant to velocity. So if I pull this up, what you'll hear is that the harder I hit the key, the more the cutoff will be open, and the softer I hit the key, the more the cutoff will be closed. So if I hit it softer, get a much warmer tone. Hit it harder, you get more of an open tone. I'm going to pull that off, though. And then key tracking basically allows each note on the keyboard to have its own cutoff frequency, so you get a more balanced overall sound. With cutoff, the key tracking down, basically the cutoff is fixed. So as you pull this up, the higher you play, the higher the cutoff goes. The lower you play, the lower the cutoff goes. So it can keep the high range still sort of bright, whereas key tracking down isn't going to do that. So our high frequency is going to be much more dampened harmonically, that is. Now, the wave shaper here, just a quick note, the wave shaper sometimes glitches out if you're like in key scale or release mode. Like I click on it and the button doesn't actually turn on, but if I go back to hide mode, it almost always works for me. So it's just a quick note. I'm sure that's just a glitch. What the wave shaper does is it's essentially sort of like a tube or like a transistor sort of like overdrive, not like a hard like guitar distortion, but just sort of like a tone shaper that's supposed to emulate different sorts of tubes or transistor based overdrive. So I'm just going to pick one of these and play with it. I'm going to try the tube like distortion, pull the input scale up a bit, and the variation basically just adds sort of a random effect and that's different to each type. So I'm not going to use that though. Get a bit of a distortion effect in there. All right, let's take a look at some of the stuff over here. We have a delay that you can turn on or off built in. I'm not going to bother going over all of the parts of it. If you're really interested in that, you can go look it up in the manual. 2 things I will cover here is the wet level is basically the wet-dry balance. So as you pull this up, you're going to hear more of the delay or less of the delay. The feedback is how much delay you're actually getting. And one of the things I love about this feedback knob is it sort of reacts like a real analog delay effect. And let me show you here. If I play a note and then start pulling the delay up, actually functions like a real life analog feedback coming from like a analog delay pedal, you know, for like guitar. So I really love that I can sort of play around with that as a musical effect. Sort of get this feedback loop, which is really cool. So I'll keep that on. Down at the bottom is just an EQ. There's basically two options. There's the high, mid, low option, and there's a whole bunch of sort of modeling options. These basically model the EQ signature of different instruments. So if I choose, you know, a dobro guitar, it's going to give me an EQ signature that's similar to that of a dobro. Not that's going to make it sound like a dobro or an acoustic guitar. It just means that that is an EQ signature that you're sort of putting on your sound. I don't really like that sound, so I'm going to turn it off. And I'm going to go back to the low, mid, high option here. With the low, mid, high option, you can control the amount from here, or you can just go in straight into the display here and pull it up, pull it down, and I can sort of like scoop out the lows, beef up the high end a bit if I want to. There we go. There we go. In the middle here, you have just a sort of like your typical volume envelope. So if I want this to be more like a pad type effect, I'd pull the attack time up, you can pull the release time up, pull the sustain up. Keep in mind that if you use like the bow or the bouncing options over here, or the blow option over here in the objects, it kind of trumps whatever the sustain was doing over here. But if I pull this up, it'll actually apply a sustained sound even to like the impulse or the plucked sounds. To get more of like a pad type sound. Here, I'm not going to bother really going over it too much, but you can create a stereo spread effect with the pickups, the left and right here. So you can click on this and pull up or down to spread the left and right pickup from the left from the A and B pickups. So I'm just going to keep that spread as it is. There's just a master volume control. I'm going to pull that down a little bit actually. I don't want to clip. And then there's just an output limiter. You can basically turn it off and it'll let the synth clip, and any of the other ones won't let the synth clip usually. Basically, a mono limiter means that every single note you play goes through the same limiter. The poly means that every note you play goes through a different limiter, and then both means that every single note you play goes through a limiter, and then that whole summation of all of those notes go through another limiter. So if you want to make sure that this synth doesn't clip, put it on both. But you won't get as much dynamic variance if you use both. All right, so that's the vast majority of sort of the synthesis elements. I think everyone's already familiar with voice count and keyboard mode. So if you're not, you can go check out one of my other videos on, you know, like the retro synth that had sort of a introduction to synthesis built into it. All right, down at the bottom, we've got two LFOs, you know, a plethora of other modulation techniques, and a morph pad that I want to check out. There's two LFOs here. They can really be assigned to anything. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off. Go to LFO 1 here. And you can have two different targets for each LFO. So unlike the ES2, where you can just have one target, one source, and you have to use another modulation router to take a different target to the same source, here we have two targets built into each LFO. So let's say that I want to create sort of like a stutter effect. I can turn on target 1, choose whatever I want as the target. I'm going to choose, notice that volume isn't in here. So I'm going to go ahead and use filter cutoff instead. And I'm going to pull the amount up. So pull this up. And my rate of my LFO is 2.1 hertz. I actually want this to be synced. So I'm going to click on sync and then choose an eighth note. So I want this to kind of move at an eighth note pulse. And what we get is this. Sort of like a quick filter sweep. The waveform right now is a sine wave. I want this to be sort of more drastic, so I'm going to choose a square wave. One of the things to note here is that they call the square wave the rectangle wave. So rectangle bipolar and unipolar are the same thing as square wave, bidirectional, and unidirectional in most other synths. So I'm going to choose rectangle bipolar, and I'm going to get a bit more of an on-off effect. One thing you'll notice, though, is if I play two keys at two different times, the motion of the LFO doesn't match up between the two notes. And that's because right now this LFO is in polyphonic mode. So the phase knob actually controls whether it's poly or mono. You can put it in the middle for some random effects, all the way to the right for poly, but I'm going to put it all the way to the left for mono. And I find usually with stutter effects and effects like this, time-based effects, I find it more useful for the LFO to be in mono because every note you play will stay in phase. So now I can play chords. Every note will stay in phase with that stutter effect regardless of when I press the key down. I want to soften up that rectangle wave a bit because it's just a bit too harsh. We're hearing a bit of a click in the signal. So what I'm going to do is pull the curve option up. And basically what this does is just sort of rounds off the waveform a bit. You can see right there in the display how it's sort of curving the top end of the wave there and giving us more of a softer effect. So I like that much better. Again, there's a second LFO. There's also a jitter modulation. What jitter modulation does is it's sort of like a random effect. So if I turn this on, I choose, I don't know, let's go with wave shaper type. Oh, I can't do that. Let's do input scale. You can set a speed for this and a depth. And basically what it does is it imposes sort of like a random LFO effect on whatever option we choose to modulate. So let's see what this sounds like. So here we're getting a little bit more or less of the wave shaper effect. It's sort of like a subtle effect, but let's try it with something more obvious like pitch. Yeah, that's really crazy. Let's pull the amount down. So just kind of randomizing pitch. I honestly don't use these jitter effects too much, so I'm not going to use them now. There's a dedicated vibrato LFO. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just the same as basically taking an LFO here and making the target pitch. It's just a dedicated LFO for vibrato. I'm not going to use that. And there's some other velocity and note on random options, as well as some MIDI controller options that I'm not going to bother going over just to kind of keep this video brief. All right, the last thing I want to go over is just the Morph pad here. What I've done is I've just gone and chosen a preset patch that I made earlier, but this can really be done with any patch that you make, even the stock patch. So what the Morph pad does is it allows you to morph and change the parameter of anything up here that has a little red dot next to it, or is it like an orange with a little red dot next to it. And this also includes the volume of each of the objects as well as the position of the pickups, some of the filter options and some of the wave shaper options, as well as the actual position of the material pad. So what you can do is you can start here at 0. There's 0, A, B, C, and D, these 5 different zones. As you move to a different zone, you'll see some of the parameters up there already change. So what I can do is move over to A here, tweak the parameters as I see fit. Move over to B and change the parameters again. I'm just kind of doing this at random. I really don't know what this is going to sound like. We'll find out in a minute though. And then C, maybe more of a glassy tone. And then finally D. There we go. So now as I move between these 5 zones, I get those different sort of tones that I created. Now, you can grab this and just move it around manually. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the sustain up a bit. just so it's a bit louder. There we go. But and by the way, you can actually automate this too. If you turn on a live automation mode, it'll it'll record the position on the morph pad. What you can do with this though is you can actually record your actual sort of the motion. The trick to this that I found, and by the way, if you click envelope mode here, you can kind of just program in and sort of draw in whatever sort of shape you want this to move in, but I prefer to kind of just move it around. So you keep the mode on pad mode. You put this on either note and move morph point or note on. And what you do is you hit R here. But what you have to do is you actually have to press a note on the keyboard to initiate the recording and then move the little red dot around. So let's try that. And then turn off the R button when you're done. So how do you know that the recording took? Well, after you do that, you just click on this envelope mode and you'll see the shape that you just drew in. Now, what it'll do by default is it'll do it and measure it just in milliseconds, the amount of time it took you to actually draw that in. And if you hit the note, you'll see that you'll actually see the little orange dot kind of play along on this, or red dot rather. But what you can do is you can actually sync this to a musical timing. So basically this is saying 15 quarter notes, 15 quarters, which is 1 quarter note shy of 16 measures of music. So they assume that you want 15 beats of, or actually it's 16, it's 1 quarter note shy of 4 measures of music. So 4 quarter notes per bar, if you are in 4/4 time, that is. So they figure, you have 16 beats of modulation, 1 beat of rest before you move on to the next chord, So now I can just play my chord or my note or whatever. So I can hold a chord out for up to basically 4 bars, 4 measures of music, and I can get this sort of evolving, moving, morphing modulation effect. So that's really cool. As far as the envelope is concerned, I'm not going to bother going over it just because it's a typical envelope. You have 2 different targets. It just looks a little different, but it functions like any other envelope. So there's actually 2 of them, by the way. So I realized I skipped over a lot of stuff here, but in order to keep this video right around 40 minutes or so, that was really the only way I could do it. Otherwise, I'd have to break this up into like a 3-part series, which I really don't want to do. Sculpture, like I said before, is really, really deep in its synthesis, and it's one of those things that could easily take hours if I went over every single option on it. So I just kind of wanted to give you a run through of how to use it and how to get started with it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks again for watching.